Okay, so yeah, this is the Chapman's Landing site in Stratham. So it's located on the Squamscott River, north of Route 108. It's a public boat ramp that's owned by New Hampshire Fish and Game. And there's a nice large salt marsh located north of the boat ramp and the parking lot. And this marsh provides important nesting habitat for the salt marsh sparrow. And there's been some past management at the site, including updates to the boat ramp and parking lots and expansion of the bridge. And the shoreline to the south of the boat ramp has been stabilized in the past with riprap. If you're looking at the photo, that's the area kind of below the gap in the fence. So based on our discussions with New Hampshire Fish and Game, their goals as the landowner include maintaining boat access and general public use, preserving salt marsh sparrow habitat, and also looking at whether erosion's occurring at the site and possible causes and mitigation strategies. So some of the impairments that we identified at the site, there's some erosion channels at the edge of the boat ramp, and these appear to be driven by runoff during heavy rain events. There's also several footpaths through the marsh in areas of flattened vegetation for people fishing, birding, and walking through the marsh. There is some marsh edge erosion, particularly just north of the boat ramp, which looking at the two top photos there, it's the area to the left of the boat ramp or the gap in the fence. So this is where we focus our living shoreline design. And there appears to be various drivers of this erosion, including riverine and tidal flows, ice, and boat wakes. We installed erosion pins last fall, and they were measured 6 months later. And based on the data we got, if we extrapolate it out to a year, there's about 1.6 inches or less of erosion per year. So based on this data, there doesn't currently appear to be a very rapid rate of erosion along this segment of the marsh edge. And we'll kind of circle back to that later in the presentation. But to quickly summarize some of the design constraints, there's bedrock located just north of the boat ramp at the edge of the river. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a need to maintain the boat ramp and the parking lots and also avoid impacts to the high marsh habitat.
Okay, so to provide criteria for design going forward, we looked at elevations for tidal datums. We were fortunate to have a few months worth of data that were observed right at the site, and use that to determine what those tidal datums are. In looking at that data, I'm sure it might, oops. Okay. In looking at that data, we had noticed that compared to, we're kind of up the Squamscott River a bit there, and compared to tidal data at CV Island or further out in Great Bay, we noticed that there is a sort of a limiting of the low tide levels, which I suspect is due to the river hydraulics there. And there's a NOAA has a calculator to calculate tidal data where you can upload data, and if you use that, you'll see that it produces mean low water, mean lower low water values that are not really reasonable. They're lower than we've seen any of the observed water there. So we noticing that we calculated the tidal data using a different method directly from the data rather than using this monthly means criteria. And that the other thing to point out here too is that this water level data and sort of difference between the bottoming out of the water at the site versus further out in the bay suggests that if with sea level rise, we might not see a direct linear change in those mean low water values, which is something that probably should be investigated if we go forward with greater detail, but for the purposes of this project, we just assume that's in here. And this is showing the data and the calculation of those values, and which would be kind of recommending going forward with the design.
Okay, here are those title datums with the corresponding vegetation zones. So there's a lot on here, but I'll just tell you kind of, so this is an interesting site. It's kind of different from a lot of these sites in that there's a huge salt marsh connected to it. So this area right next to the boat ramp that we're focusing on is really just a small sliver of the greater site. That area where we propose a toe treatment or an edge treatment would be all low marsh. So in terms of plantings, it would just be a one species planting plan of Spartina alterniflora, that low marsh grass. So, but in terms of the entire marsh, we're seeing that it's really right above the mean high water line. So you think, okay, this whole marsh is going to be high marsh. That's sort of true, but I just want to quickly look at this ortho imagery. It's really interesting to look at the aerial imagery for this site because you can tell just from the colors a lot about the vegetation zones. So again, here's the ramp. Here's our area of interest. It's a little strip of low marsh that's right at the edge. You can kind of see there's a color difference. This is a brighter green. And then this whole area of lighter green is like your classic high marsh Spartina patens. But just a quick note about thinking about the whole site on a more holistic level, we recognize that there's obviously something going on here. And what you see in the cross section is that it's a little lower in elevation up here. So you have all of these mega pools forming. So just to note that, you know, we have a unique situation where, because we're working with Fish and Game, there's probably opportunity to do monitoring at this site, maybe monitoring of the marsh plain up here. That would be interesting to see, especially considering that this is the critical area for salt marsh sparrow nesting. So that area, and you can even see the mega pools, and all that red is Salicornia seed last word. But you can kind of see that under this photo. But this is the SLAM modeling, and the brown is all projected tidal flat, mud flat for 2100. So something that we were thinking about, and I guess just when thinking about recommendations, you know, this is such a small little piece, but you know, I guess one question is, well, can you maintain this as marsh, but what happens to the rest of the marsh?
So at our site, because we found erosion to be pretty minimal, only a couple of inches per year, and because there's that extensive, relatively healthy marsh at our site, which we really don't want to disturb because of the salt marsh sparrow that is there, a really large population that uses the site. And because the site is more threatened by sea level rise than by erosion, we were recommending a no action alternative with continued monitoring. However, we did go ahead with the living shoreline design in case erosion increases in the future and stabilization is needed to protect the boat ramp or the salt marsh, the existing salt marsh. And also because the site is Fish and Game owned, it is an opportunity for innovative approaches and an opportunity to engage the public and educate them. We also looked at some other site improvements like stormwater runoff and improving pedestrian access in a way that's not as damaging to the marsh. And we also considered an adaptation pathway approach to consider metrics at what point we might take action in the future. So this is an overview of the living shoreline concept. You can see in the purple line is the proposed rock and root wad toe or sill. And then, so that would be an extension of the existing salt marsh to about 10 to 20 feet from the existing edge. And then north of that rock and root wad sill area, we proposed 3 rows of coir and oyster logs placed directly on the mud flat, secured with wooden stakes. And that area would be kind of a more experimental approach, and it would be an interesting thing to try at the site. And it would help to slow erosion of that marsh edge and kind of serve as like a transition between that point and help accumulate sediment behind it, and also hopefully encourage oysters at the site in the future. And you can see this is at low tide, and there's like this rocky, the bedrock that's exposed at low tide, and it's 20 feet or more width. So this is a proposed transect C, which is about 100 feet downstream of the boat ramp. You can see our rock and root wad sill, which is about 2 feet above the mean tide line to account for sea level rise. We have the occasional boulder to break up ice, and a tie into the existing ground surface using these coir logs as slope breaks. And because the proposed area is all below the mean high water, we're proposing just low marsh vegetation, the Spartina alterniflora. And this proposed project would fall under the minimum impact New Hampshire DES wetland permit because it's just less than 200 linear feet.
I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna go down one. So they're not in the right order. That's my fault. So anyway, my contribution as a landscape architect was to really look at some of the site stormwater issues, the erosion, marsh protection, and also the public use. So you can see here, this is the existing conditions between the parking, and this is the marsh. And there's kind of like unrestricted access through the marsh. And this is being mowed currently. There's a lot of erosion that is caused by this paved driveway. Comes right down to more of a compacted gravel parking area for trailers and trucks that are towing them. And you can see the erosion here. And there's a wood guardrail and the kiosk here. And this kind of keeps people from going in there, but it doesn't really restrict them. After a site analysis, the recommendations based on what was an issue related to the site. It was there's right now the sidewalk is on the opposite side of the road, and the upper parking lot is used for daily use if you don't have a trailer. And there's no access, safe access or handicapped accessible access down to the lower ramp. And Fish and Game did discuss the possibility of a viewing area. So the idea was to have more of a paved access route from the upper parking lot down here, and then turning it into a more raised boardwalk, which could, if it ended here, could be used for viewing out into the marsh. And to mitigate some of the unrestricted pedestrian use of creating trails in the marsh, a vegetative barrier would be installed of like maybe bayberry or beach plum that was dense to keep people or discourage them from going beyond the controlled access. At the boat ramp, right now, it's very steep and it needs to be extended to flatten it out and widen to, prevent that erosion. At the end of the asphalt drive here, regrading the parking lot so that it actually, if there's a swale here or either a trench grate to capture the rainwater that comes down here, and then it outlets into either a rain garden here or a rain garden on this side. I also thought that it would make sense to there's one parking spot here, and to allow the marsh to continue out like another 15 feet. And then have the kiosk not restricted, that you could actually, Fish and Game could use the kiosk to let people know exactly what they're doing and the improvements that were being made on the site.
So gonna have to move pretty quick here. But I mean, a key thing at this site was, the key question was if and when to intervene. I mean, we've been recommending here for the near term an approach that is the do nothing alternative and continued monitoring at this site. As was mentioned, we're seeing on the order of millimeters to inches per year, not feet per year. So one of the things that we looked at as part of this with a planning-based approach for the if and when to intervene was adapting really adaptive pathways approach, and schematically planning out over time how to phase in some of this and when to phase it in, and basing that off of monitoring data, which could be a combination of different metrics, sea level rise, erosion. Another big one here is the nesting success of the salt marsh area itself. Granted, they find a better site in the future with sea level rise, hopefully. So with things like boardwalk features and recreational amenities, the boat ramp, these could be phased in over time. And I'm not going to go into details of the pathways themselves, since we have them in the detailed report. But just a couple, just to show the idea of when to think about things like applying for grant funding, since this isn't right at the top of the list for things like the boat ramp immediately, but also when to intervene based on rate of sea level rise, and phasing in these over time. So you want to have multiple disturbances over time, adjusting to sea level rise, or kind of progress this based on higher rates that you see up front. So just again, based on the design guidance, the challenge here is if not competing objectives from landowner, there's multiple objectives with respect to built infrastructure versus the salt marsh itself. So different tolerances, different timeframes makes it a bit of a challenge. And just in terms of monitoring that sea level rise over time, having that be based on monitoring can help guide when to intervene for those different points. So again, just recapping for now, the recommendation is not to intervene, especially with the habitat for salt marsh sparrow. But again, recapping that this would make a good site for some research and innovation, especially if there is foot to sea level rise in the next couple of decades. This would be a great site, even if not for the edge erosion benefits at this particular site, but for Great Bay in general, seeing the success of oyster culture and oyster success, because that needs to be subtitled. So we can be there for questions.
Okay,